In accordance with the customs of this university, I will open this academic ceremony with a prayer. Spiritus Sancti gratia illuminet sensus et corda nostra. May the grace of the Holy Spirit illuminate our senses and our hearts. Please be seated. I welcome you all to the public defense of the thesis of Anita Slonimska. My name is José Sanders, and I am here today as the representative of the Rector Magnificus of this university. I welcome the defendant and the paranymphs, and I also welcome the promoter and co-promoter and the committee, Professor Onno Krasborn, Professor Ted Gibson, Professor Dr. Aaron Wilkinson, Dr. Sabina Fontana, Professor Pamela Pernis, and Dr. Mark Dingemanse. I now turn the floor to the PhD candidate.
With the permission of the Council of Deans, and in order to obtain the degree of doctor from Radboud University, Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my doctoral thesis entitled The Role of Iconicity and Simultaneity in Efficient Communication in the Visual Modality, Evidence from LIS or Italian Sign Language. In our everyday lives, we communicate about various events. They can be quite simple as they contain little information. For example, events involving a single character. Other events can be quite complex as they contain a lot of information. For example, multiple characters interacting with each other. Language is a tool that allows us to communicate about these and other events, would they be simple or complex. However, languages can be expressed in different modalities. And by modality, I mean that spoken languages are expressed in vocal modality. And here I mean the speech. Speech is expressed in vocal modality by producing a sequence of sounds to form words arranged one by one. On the other hand, sign languages, which are natural languages used by the deaf communities, are expressed entirely in the visual modality. And differences in the linguistic modality give rise to the modality-specific properties. Compared to speech, visual modality affords sign languages to use more iconicity, which is form-meaning mapping. Furthermore, visual modality allows simultaneity, which means using multiple body articulators to express distinct meanings. The general aim of my dissertation was to investigate the role of these visual modality-specific properties in efficient communication in sign languages, and more specifically in LIS, in Italian Sign Language. The same event, such as the one we see on the screen, can be encoded in different ways in sign languages. It can be done by using lexical signs, which can be compared to words in spoken languages. For example, let's see a description of this event in LIS. When using lexical signs, they are arranged one by one, similarly like words are arranged in speech. In these examples, we see that although both actions of the girl, holding and petting, are perceptually simultaneous in English and in LIS in this example, they are expressed individually in a linear manner. However, the visual modality of sign languages allows organizing information not only linearly, but also simultaneously. In the next example, we will see that after introducing both characters by means of lexical signs, signer uses depicting strategy to represent the girl and her actions. Here we see that in addition to linear structure, signer uses multiple body articulators to express multiple event elements simultaneously, something that is impossible in speech. In the first depiction, head and hands of the signer are used to represent the girl and her holding action in an iconic way, that is to visually resemble the event elements. And in the second depiction, signer iconically represents the girl holding action and petting action. Furthermore, signer also uses iconicity to organize articulators in space in such a way so that they reflect the relation between elements in the event. Here we see that using visual modality-specific properties, simultaneity and iconicity, allows signers to represent events more directly. However, it remains unclear in which contexts signers prefer using these iconic and simultaneous constructions over lexical signs, and communicative function of such constructions remains little understood. In my dissertation, I proposed a hypothesis that simultaneous and iconic constructions are used for efficient communication in sign languages. Efficient communication means successful information transmission with minimal effort for language production and comprehension. And according to some claims, linguistic structure is a result of languages evolving under pressure to be communicatively efficient. However, everything we know so far about how communicative efficiency is achieved comes from research on spoken languages. For example, research has shown that one way to minimize production and comprehension effort is clustering related words as closely together as possible. In the present dissertation, I argue that simultaneous and iconic constructions allow clustering related meanings closer together not only linearly, but also simultaneously. Accordingly, such constructions might be used with a function to achieve efficient communication. If so, a direct prediction from a production point of view would be that with an increase of information in an event, signers should increase use of simultaneous constructions. Namely, with the increase of information to be communicated, production effort increase, considering that more information has to be processed. As a result, signers should increase those strategies that are communicatively efficient. In order to test this prediction, I designed an experiment. In this experiment, I manipulated the pressure for communicative efficiency by systematically increasing the number of information units in perceptually simultaneous events. In the most simple event, just 2 characters had to be introduced. In the most complex event, not only both characters, but also their actions had to be described. I used a director-matcher task to embed the descriptions of the images in a strictly informative context. A participant had the role of the director, and they were asked to describe images appearing on a TV screen to a matcher, so that matcher, who was a confederate, could pick the correct image on their laptop. I used this experimental design to test my hypothesis by answering 3 research questions I investigated in my dissertation. In Chapter 2, I investigated the first research question to see whether simultaneous and iconic constructions are used for efficient communication in lists. To answer this question, I focused on the information organization structure used by list signers. In the next step, I shifted my focus to exploring the role of depiction as a linguistic strategy for efficient communication. Thus, in Chapter 3, I investigated what linguistic strategies are used for efficient communication in lists. I used the same data collected in Chapter 2, but here I analyze it from the perspective of the linguistic strategies used. In Chapter 4, I investigated whether simultaneous and iconic constructions constitute an emergent property of sign languages. This is a crucial factor to consider in order to assess my hypothesis. Because consider that people who don't know any sign language, but are asked to use only their body and gestures to communicate, can also use their body articulators and iconicity as a general affordance of the visual modality to depict events. Thus, if simultaneous and iconic constructions used by signers is not simply a general affordance of the visual modality, but a linguistic property for efficient communication, it must have evolved as an adaptation for pressure for communicative efficiency. I assessed this question by comparing the descriptions of signers analyzed in Chapters 2 and 3 to the descriptions of hearing adult participants who did not know any sign language but were asked to use only their body and gestures to communicate. In the interest of time, in this presentation, I will report the main results of Chapters 2 and 4 only. In Chapter 2, I coded the simultaneous constructions used by signers. Results reveal that signers use more simultaneous constructions as the information in the events increase. In Chapter 4, quantitative results reveal that signers use more simultaneous constructions than non-signers. And qualitative analysis showed that signers use simultaneity and iconicity to be more coherent and informative in their descriptions. To conclude, in my dissertation, I show that signers of lists take advantage of the visual modality-specific properties to be communicatively efficient when describing perceptually simultaneous events. Furthermore, I show that simultaneity and iconicity used by list signers are not simply affordances of the visual modality, but linguistic properties that have evolved to maximize communicative efficiency. Taken together, in this dissertation, I show that the modality in which language is expressed influences how communicative efficiency is achieved. And with this dissertation, I hope to have provided a new avenue for future research to explore communicative efficiency through a lens of a broader multimodal view of language. Having presented the summary of my dissertation, I return the floor to the rector.
Thank you. We will now start with the defense, and I will give first the floor to Professor Onno Krasborn from Radboud University. He's joining us by Zoom. Hope he will be visual.
Yes, great.
There he is. and he is the chair of the committee, and he will pose the first question. The floor is to Professor Krasborn.
Thank you, Madam Dean. Dear candidate, let me start by congratulating you with an impressive thesis. I think you've made an important contribution to our understanding of deaf communication and human expression in general by looking at communicative efficiency and how this affects the cotemporal expression of information units. In addition, you've looked at the iconic spatial relations between units that this cotemporality allows, something for which the visual modality in combination with the many available articulators of the human body is uniquely suited. Your thesis strengthens our understanding that has been slowly emerging in the last 20 years that signed languages are not only linguistic systems on a par with spoken languages in terms of their complex linguistic organization, but they're also rich in depictive and expressive power expressed by the many paths to iconicity that the visual modality offers. You've managed to put this work into the broader context of several ongoing debates, and I would like to commend you for this. I have a question in relation to your chapter 3 and the discussion section, in particular on page 108, you say, and I cite, when coding the data, we were faced with ever-growing doubts about the correctness and feasibility of distinguishing between lexical signs and constructed action. Specifically, determining the cutoff points between lexical and depicting signs was sometimes quite problematic. And a bit later in that paragraph, rather than dividing the world into two based on linguistic versus gestural or discrete versus gradient dichotomies, it would perhaps be wiser to consider it as a continuum, with signs having the possibility of being used on a spectrum between the two categories, which are equally linguistics on both ends and in between. This leads to two questions, really. The first is a small one, and that is that although you discuss the validity of this distinction here, there seems to be little problem in actually making it. In page 95 above, you indicate that the two annotators were reliably able to apply this distinction. You report a coherence kappa of 0.90. So is there really an issue then if you can do this reliably? That's the first part of the question. The second part is, why would this contrast between lexical signs and constructed action go against the notion of bounded lexicality, as you say? The fact that it is difficult to establish whether a sign means what you see or means something more specific that's stored in the lexicon does not actually mean that it's a relevant distinction. The resources you used, spread the sign and the dictionary, make no claim to completeness in the quantity or in the completeness of the semantic description. And although you cite a lot of Lindsay Ferrara's work and also Johnston and Shembry's early work on the sign lexeme, you don't cite Johnston and Ferrara's paper on multi-word expressions. In this paper, they argue that complex depictive forms, and they would say the same for constructed action, can both have a literal multi-word meaning, translated to a multi-word expression in English, for example, and a simpler idiomatic meaning. Like in a sign T in Lis, which is the same in the Netherlands, there's both the literal interpretation of dipping something up and down in a container and the idiomatic reading T. So if these two are present at the same time, where is the continuum? I imagine Lindsay Ferrara asking, and I'm asking it here in her place, as it were. I would like to ask you to reflect a bit on this.
Honored sir, thank you for your compliments on my dissertation. As to your first smaller question regarding the reliability and the good reliability in coding, indeed this good reliability was achieved because we had very strict rules in what should be considered a lexical sign and what should be considered constructed action or a depicting sign. And we went with a very conservative approach in regard to that lexical sign would be marked as lexical sign only if it was performed exactly like it is specified in the vocabulary or informed by the deaf participants. So if there was any adjustment to the lexical sign, then it could no longer then be considered lexical sign, because there was exactly this moment of gradients that it could be adjusted. And this goes into your second question regarding the bounded lexicality and sort of whether then this distinction and where is the continuum between the lexical frozen sign and where is this gradient iconic, less conventionalized, more gradient sign. And in our research, indeed, in my research, this showed this big argument came up exactly because of the difficulty of coding these lexical signs in contrast to constructed action depicting constructions, exactly because sometimes there were these very little differences and sometimes there were bigger differences. And as I count the sign for petting, indeed was very difficult, because if it was larger or if the hand shape was just in a slightly different way then, or articulated in a different way in a more, let's say, construction action type of way, then it was considered a constructed action. And thus we see that this lexical sign can indeed drift from being frozen form with a specific hand shape, with a specific location, with a specific movement. It can be adjusted on the go if it's necessary to make it more precise in order for it to reflect the meaning that it is referring to. This lexical sign can become more gradient and it can become more used in a more iconic way to represent the meaning it is referring to. And exactly also with your example with the T, that there is a lexical sign for T, and it is the same, that this sign can also be adjusted, and the same sign can be used as a constructed action. And thus it becomes difficult to understand what should be considered a lexical sign and what we should consider constructed action, because indeed it might go to we might conclude that it all boils down to having an entry in a dictionary or not having an entry in dictionary, and also how precise and how fixed forms are we looking for. And the most important aspect being that all these different semiotic resources, more fixed and more flexible, all of them can be used as a single instrument in creating the most efficient and most expressive encoding.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will now go to Professor Ted Gibson of MIT, who is joining us via Zoom. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anita, for a very interesting thesis. I enjoyed reading it. I think it's a very interesting contribution to the literature. So I have just one kind of long, complex-ish question, and that is, you say that in your presentation here, also you say that LIST is efficient in some way. It might be efficient, and the idea is that it allows getting multiple ideas across simultaneously, or sign language in general, but LIST, which you investigated. And so my question is, what do you mean by efficiency here? I kind of want a definition, and so that I can have, like, relative to what? So what are some baselines such that it might be more or less efficient than some baselines, such that, what's a random baseline, which I assume would be less efficient, it was more efficient than that, and what's an optimal baseline such that it'll be less efficient than that, or maybe optimal baselines with no simultaneous meaning passing. I'm just thinking of baselines here, and so that those baselines might help us to see how optimal this or other sign languages are in getting meanings across simultaneously. And so that's my question is, what exactly do you mean by efficiency, and can we quantitatively measure that? And are such or has anyone ever done this for any sign languages, or are there like a corpus or something that someone's coded for their meaning passing information or something like that? So the same question, what do you mean by efficiency?
Honored sir, thank you for your compliments. So let's go first to the definition of communicative efficiency. I defined communicative efficiency by taking your paper as an example and defining it as precise, easy, robust information transmission, or put in different words, successful information transmission with minimal effort for language production and comprehension. That's on the basis level. However, given that there has been no research on communicative efficiency in sign languages, in my research I thought we have to start somewhere. So thinking about the visual modality, specific properties, and how information can be constructed in sign languages, I looked into the literature on communicative efficiency in spoken languages and looked what are these universal principles, what do we find in spoken languages. And in spoken languages we find that clustering related meanings closer together is a communicatively efficient strategy, given that experiments have shown that it leads to minimizing cognitive processing effort for production and comprehension. Thus, my hypothesis was that simultaneous constructions could function in the same way. Thus, I approached it in an experimental design by increasing the pressure for communicative efficiency and seeing, sort of posing hypotheses whether these simultaneous constructions are used or not used, assuming that a language constitutes a communicatively efficient system, going from the framework that if we assume that language has evolved for communicative efficiency. Thus, the structures that we, assuming that structures that we would find in Italian Sign Language under pressure when the signers have to communicate under pressure for communicative efficiency, they would use those structures that are efficient for them. However, it is true that we are missing the other side of the story, which is the comprehension, seeing on whether these structures used by signers are actually efficient in the comprehension. Thus, but given that this constitutes the very first step and the very first investigation into looking what structures might be used in sign languages for communicative efficiency, I thought it would be a good way to start. But what you mentioned in regard to the baseline, it indeed would be a very strong indication and strong result in showing that the baseline, which wouldn't be so simultaneous, if that would be less efficient than the simultaneous constructions used.
Okay, thank you. Can you just elaborate what you mean by, like, what would, I really had a legitimate question, like what would the baselines be? Like what do you think a random baseline is, and what do you think, like, do you really think that the optimal, I mean, what is the optimal baseline? That is like with, you sign it all at once, like that's the optimal baseline? Is that the optimal? I mean, that's it's a legitimate question. I'm not like, it's not a trick or anything. I really want to know what you think.
Yeah, sure. So how you can also see in my thesis that it is not only about compressibility. What the data that I've shown, it is not about reducing the length and stacking everything into a single construction. It is indeed building an utterance so that the information that has been encoded previously can be integrated with the new information that is coming in. A most simple example would be, let's say, that the signer introduces the characters and then signs that the larger character is holding a smaller character, and then in the next sign, keeping holding the action encoded on the one hand, adding in a diagrammatic relation this another information unit. And this I mean by communicative efficiency and by clustering related meanings closer together, that in sign languages, these upcoming information units can be given not as a single individual meaning unit that has to be then integrated with the preceding information that is kept in working memory, but that these upcoming information units that are encoded, that they can be integrated with the articulators that are already in use and that express information, thus creating these more complex simultaneous constructions. But in no way I would consider a single simultaneous construction depicting an event efficient one, because it would, speculating that it would be a lot of cognitive effort for production and comprehension, producing everything at once. So it is more about building and connecting information to each other. And unlike in spoken languages where information is connected linearly, we see that in sign languages this information can be connected simultaneously. So
okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We now go to Dr. Erin Wilkinson of the University of New Mexico, who joins us via Zoom. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anita, for your motivation. I did enjoy your presentation. As you know, I'm an American professor, and so it was also really nice to get your manuscript beforehand and be able to read it. They did it similar in Canada, but they do not do that in the USA. So I have a follow-up question related to Dr. Gibson's question. It's interesting to read through your dissertation, and overall, your implication, though it's not your focus, seems to emphasize the idea that perhaps the linearization of sign languages itself is equally proportionate to efficient communication, which means that the more linear that a sentence is, the less efficient the communication is. But I was wondering if you have an argument that can support that statement and support this idea of compression being more efficient.
Honored Madame, thank you for your compliments. I would like to clarify that in no way am I making an absolute statement that simultaneity is more efficient than linearity. I would say that it has to do also with the content and with the type of information we're communicating about. So when I am taking a position that when it comes to communicating about perceptually simultaneous events, especially those that involve animate reference, and given that signers have possibility to employ multiple articulators and represent these events more directly, more precisely, more connected to the actual phenomena, to the actual event they're referring to. In this case, I would argue that in this case, simultaneous constructions should indeed be preferred or more communicatively efficient than the linearized ones. If we look at spoken languages, we see that this diagrammatic iconicity that is the driving force that allows connecting these multiple event elements into this single, more direct representation. This diagrammatic iconicity is also used in spoken languages, but to refer to sequentiality, as in vedi, vidi, vici. So we first say the thing that happened, what is happening now, and that happens next, because it just makes sense, it is easier to process. In the same way, I argue, although I am perfectly aware that the comprehension part for this is missing, but I would like to believe that in my dissertation, given that we find the results in production, that this simultaneity is indeed used, that there is this diagrammatic iconicity can be used for this simultaneity, for expressing simultaneously perceptual events simultaneously, something that is impossible in speech.
Thank you very much. I will hold my second question if we have time for another round. So I move on to the next committee member.
Thank you. We will now go to Dr. Sabine Fontana of the University of Catania in Sicily. The floor is yours.
I would like first to say that I really appreciated your work and in the way it brings together different perspectives to enlighten the notion, to explore the notion of communicative efficiency, and in the way it explores also simultaneity and iconicity. I've also appreciated your methodology, which, as you said, it has been built together with a deaf researcher. And I think it manages to verify the behavior of a deaf person and also hearing people in the way it interact with the load, with increasing of the load. My question is about variation. I would like to ask you if you have met any kind of variation in your sample, and how have you accounted for it? Thank you.
Honored Madame, thank you for your compliments. As for your question, variability, of course, is inevitable, especially in research on language. So, of course, there was variability. But exactly for this reason, I used statistical methods that could factor it out and that I would be able to account for it. I used generalized mixed effects models that allow also including the random intercepts for the participants and for the trials. Thus, I could be sure that the results that I'm attaining are not driven by some possible confounding factors. However, variability definitely is there. And if I have to think about the clearest case during coding that I noticed, it has to do with the most difficult levels of the events, especially the ones where there are both reference and both reference are interacting with each other. While some participants would use these highly complex constructions encoding all 4 or 3 information units, so both reference and both actions, or a referent or both actions in these complex simultaneous and iconic constructions. Other participants would split this complex construction in 2 by first encoding the information about one referent, so one referent and his actions, and other referent and their actions. Thus, arguably, this being articulatorily less straining strategy. And I think this also indicates that there is definitely room for investigation for individual variation. Is it a personal style? Does it have to do with the articulatory effort? Does it have to do with cognitive effort? And of course, on the comprehension side, then how do these different strategies, what is the most beneficial for on the comprehension side? And also, what is the individual variability on the comprehension side? But as for my results, given the statistical methods I used, I'm certain that I have accounted for this individual variation.
Thank you. We will now go to the next opponent, and this is Professor Pamela Pernis from the University of Cologne, Germany. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Anita, I also want to congratulate you on a wonderful thesis. My question concerns chapter 4 and your comparison between silent gestures and list signers, and you're finding that, or one of the main points to come out of it is that silent gestures can also package information simultaneously, but they don't do it as much, and they don't package as many components simultaneously as list signers do. And so one of your points is that this ability doesn't come for free just by virtue of using the visual modality, but you need a linguistic system to be able to take advantage of it or properly take advantage of it. And my question concerns a third population, namely L2 learners or adult learners of a sign language who have no previous experience with signing. And it's a population from whom we know, or about whom we know that especially simultaneity, expressing things simultaneously is actually quite difficult. So I wanted you to comment on where you would kind of place them in terms of their ability or not to use this system. So with silent gestures, you also mentioned that gestures offload, use gesture to be able to offload information. So this kind of ease of processing of holding something in space and adding elements on, but being able to manipulate this and to kind of target this ease of processing in the right way comes with some sort of practice. And so I want you to just elaborate a little bit about where this third population of L2 learners of a sign language falls, and in what way they are and are not able to take advantage of a linguistic system, or when they might be able to, and what the factors are that are relevant here.
Honored Madame, thank you for your compliments. Your question is very interesting, and I have been thinking about it recently as well, that it would be a very interesting group to do this study with and see what is happening with the L2 learners, also in regard to different levels of proficiency. Because indeed, I think so the use of their simultaneous constructions would depend on the level of understanding of the language, and especially understanding of what constructed action is and what it can be and how it can be used. Also from if I may, from personal experience, when starting to learn about sign language, you learn that there is a possibility to use constructed action, which means just becoming a referent, so I can just show whatever the referent does, and this will be precise. And soon enough, we learn that it is not the case, that there is body partitioning, that you can represent multiple referents, that you can use different perspectives, observer perspective, character perspective, combined together. So it boils down to really knowing the possibilities of the language and knowing the tools that you can use for constructing meaning. And with these tools, there are lexical signs that are the fixed forms that can be used. There is constructed action that allows using body to map the body. There are depicting signs, and all of these, it comes with the practice and knowledge of all these possibilities to then be able to combine them. And as for the L2 signers, I would assume, also reflecting on personal experience, that it might really start as it starts for the silent gesturers, especially when training on using constructed action, because there is not yet this linguistic awareness that this is a linguistic tool that I can combine with other linguistic tools to make my production more precise, more efficient, and more effective. And as this practice and as the understanding of all this richness of the tools and sign languages that there are evolves, also would the proficiency in using simultaneous constructions evolve. I think the main, from the data that I see, the main resource is body partitioning and understanding that the body doesn't have to map on the same referent, but the body can be, that multiple articulators can indeed be used to reflect, to represent, to encode different information units, and that there are these tools such as diagrammatic iconicity and iconicity that can be used to bind all of these multiple information units together.
Thank you. We now go to the final member of the committee, and that is Dr. Mark Dingemanse of Radboud University. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear candidate, also my congratulations on a nice thesis that I've read with great interest. Now, I have a question about chapter 4 and 2, but mostly about 4. You went for a confederate design to ensure all participants got the same feedback, as you note. So in chapter 4 you write, the matcher was a confederate who had been instructed to look attentively at what the participant was producing, provide positive feedback, a head nod, okay gesture, and so on. After the participant had finished their description in each trial, and no verbal or non-verbal signals of feedback indicating doubt were given. Same in chapter 2, actually. And moreover, we learn actually that in chapter 4, the confederate had direct and exclusive access to the image being described, so they were not actually a matcher. They were just a prop, really. So not only was there no interaction, you might even say there was no communication, actually, in this experiment, and no director-matcher task. So I want to challenge you a bit and ask, have you actually studied communication in this thesis, or have you studied two groups of people that differ in how practiced they are in the skillful use of the body, of bodily articulators? And as an add-on to that, I want to actually return to the design and draw your attention to one aspect of interaction that there was, which was the experience, the presence of the experimenter. Because the experimenter was there, and we learned that actually sometimes the experimenter monitoring the production asked the director to reproduce or redo what they just did. When that happened, it was never included in your analysis, leading to some cases of excluded or missing data. And I noticed an interesting pattern in those missing data points in the silent gesture study. There's 43 of them, if I'm correct. That's about 3 times as much as in the science study. But they're not evenly distributed. Most of the stuff that goes missing is in the higher dimensionality levels, dimension 4 and 5. About 1 in 8 observations go missing. So I kind of see these poor gesturers trying their hardest and being called on their imperfect production, and then not being included in design at all. So it looks like your design really pushed these gesturers to their limit, and without the scaffolding normally provided in interaction, they simply couldn't do it. But I want to challenge you on another point. Is that interactive scaffolding not precisely a point of and a part of communicative efficiency? So there's 2 challenges for you there.
Honored sir, thank you for your compliments and for your interesting questions. As for the design using the confederate, indeed I decided to use a confederate in order to be sure that the same type of feedback has been given to the participants. I wouldn't want to agree with you on the fact that there is no communication because our participants didn't know it. And for them, this was a communication because they would receive the feedback. It always was positive, true, but they were also incentivized to provide clear descriptions so that the player they were playing with could actually choose the right image. So it was, given that it was all centered on the producer and what producer thought and the context in which producer found themselves, I would like to argue that the producers, our participants, would they be signers or silent gesturers, they were in a communicative setting because they had a person in front of them to whom they had to transmit information, and their interlocutor had to make a decision based on the information they have transmitted. Indeed, there was no interaction in a sense of providing back and forth answer question types, but there was a communication in transmitting information and confirming that this information has been received and understood. So this is to your first point. And as to the second point, having a tough task for the silent gestures, indeed it is true, and indeed the silent gestures struggled more with producing all of this information, which is of course also expected because communicating by using only their body and gestures is not something that they know how to do. And that exactly was the point. Given that all of us have these general affordances of using multiple articulators, using iconicity, representing the meaning in context when we cannot use language, or just generally, given that we have these properties that we can use, exactly that was the core in having, in this case, this as the baseline of what is how does general affordance of the visual modality in the form of simultaneity and iconicity look? And then how do these properties look when they are part of a linguistic system? And indeed, when they are part of a linguistic system, we see that they are used more efficiently. And indeed, given that there is this linguistic system that allows using all of these tools, possibly also makes this task easier for the signers, considering that it is easier for them than to package all of this information.
So as the experimenter, you're the only one, if I may, a brief intervention, you're the only one who can tell us what happened in those missing trials, and I'm really curious actually, because it is really quite striking. It's only 2% of trials go missing in the lowest dimensionality, but it's up to 13% in the highest, and that's striking. It's not the case in the sign language data, only in the silent gesture data, and I want you to speculate also, besides telling us what happened there, speculate on how that might have affected your results. Had you included them, had you allowed actually people to interact in the way that we, for instance, do at a defense like this, where I'm pointedly not only providing positive feedback and pretending I understand, but actually countering you so that we get deeper.
Yes, this already becomes a more difficult and complex level of interaction in my thesis, given that this really hasn't done before. I started with the very basic, the first stepping stone on which the future researcher can step and expand. But as for the missing trials, indeed, also given that I coded the data, I think it has to do with a really very rich complex simultaneous event where a lot of things are happening at the same time. Most often in the fifth level, in the most difficult level, when there is a larger referent who holds and pets the smaller referent, and the smaller referent is doing action in return, also signers and silent gesturers would often forget the caressing action or the action of the smaller referent. So they would be overburdened with a lot of things going on at the same time. And in the fourth level, I'm now actually thinking about the fourth level, and I think in that case, maybe all the focus was on the smaller referent who was doing a dynamic action, and thus this holding action could have been left out. But I'm happy to look at that data, and the points you bring up are indeed very interesting. And as for the speculation for how the data might have looked like if I would have included it, in all honesty, I don't think it would have looked much different, given that still the result, including these trials would only then diminish the simultaneity used, given that it was not adding information, but it was leaving information out. Thus, it could only make the data, let's say, a bit not so conservative, because in this case, we could be as conservative as possible that in whatever they could do with their body, they did reach their maximum capacity in expressing all of these information. It's also making it directly comparable to signers, because if we would keep these left out trials where something is left out, then I would need to also count what is left out exactly, and then I couldn't compare these two groups in a direct way.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now return to our first opponent for his second question, and we give the floor to Professor Onno Krasborn once again. The floor is yours.
I think it's muted.
Microphone issue? This better? Thank you. I'm sorry. I'll start again. In chapter 4, you study two alternative hypotheses, and the one that receives support from your study is that if simultaneity has emerged as a linguistic property for achieving greater communicative efficiency, simultaneity is found more in signers than in silent gesturers when faced with the same information demands. Now, I miss a complementary explanation, or perhaps an alternative explanation for these same findings. And that is not so much a matter of linguistic encoding, but rather a matter of motoric skill that is more developed in the signers that you studied than in the speakers. So in other words, are you really looking at the emergence of a linguistic system that exploits simultaneity in chapters 3 and 4, or are you looking at people who, because of the monomodal visual nature of their language, have maximized their articulatory control over manual and non-manual articulators, whatever they're trying to express?
Honored
Question
sir.
mark.
Yes. Honored sir, I would like to argue against this, that this is not an indication of a better use, or just of a better use of motoric skills and more experience with using the body, because if we think what allows signers to achieve these more simultaneous constructions has to do, of course, with using multiple body articulators, but it also has to do with having the linguistic tools, with conventionalized tools, and also with the conventionalized use of the body, that the body is not a single articulator that then can be used to show reference in an iconic way, but multiple body articulators that can also use different linguistic strategies can all be used together for these highly simultaneous constructions. Because if we look at what kind of simultaneous constructions silent gesturers are using, there we indeed find that this has to do with having a body and having ability to represent the actions that some animate entity is also representing. But what we see in signers, that it is not simply a skillful use of the body articulators or the motoric skills, that it is a skillful use of these properties, but in a different way. It is a skillful use of iconicity in form of also lexicalized signs and also depicting constructions and constructed action, all of which can be combined. And it is also use of this diagrammatic iconicity that then allows diagrammatic iconicity, may I add, in combination with body partitioning, that allows interrelating all of these articulators together. And exactly for this reason, I do strongly argue that it is a clear indication that it is a linguistic resource, that it is a general affordance that has evolved and optimized in a linguistic system to allow these complex simultaneous constructions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We now go back to Professor Ted Gibson from MIT in the USA via Zoom to pose his second question. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I actually think I took up too much time in the first round, and so I'm going to pass to Professor Wilkinson. I actually asked you like 3 questions at once, and so I'm going to pass to Professor Wilkinson.
Thank you very much. Professor Wilkinson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of the explanations that we've received, because I feel like it's very informative and it's starting to align things for us. I think in your study, when we're looking at lease and the silent gestures, this is something that I want to explore a little bit more, because when we look at the gestures overall, I think the question is, I mean, and I kind of want to come back to this idea of that language experiences, when we talk of deaf people, their language experiences can be very diverse. So the idea of simultaneity, use of different reference, all of that can come and become a very dynamic and complex communicative event. And so with people who are perhaps the same age, I'm trying to phrase this correctly, but should we then expect that deaf people who are similar in age, who are similar in just their criteria, if we had different criteria for them, would they implement the same or perhaps different tools? I think it would be the same in terms of their communicative strategies. Because we do understand that there is variation that exists, but how does this variation affect these dynamics of the communication, like the complexity of their communication? And it's not just age, it could also be other factors as well. I'm thinking of just the language structure, the linguistic structure, what is permitted, what is not permitted in that particular language. So looking at perhaps different communities and different ways that these communities express different ideas, how they are constructing their communication to be efficient. And so I guess it goes back to my general question of how would you argue that language experience contributes to the signer and their ability to handle complex information, some of these more complex events? What is your answer to that question?
Honored Madam, your question regards the different variability and different experiences that signers have when interacting with each other in the context they're finding themselves in, and how that influences then how these communicatively efficient, which communicatively efficient strategies are achieved, if I understand correctly. So there is definitely a factor of the common ground, and it is inevitably there. If I'm communicating in a family where I have been had a lot of experience communicating about all the same repetitive topics and the things that we all know about and shared, and the communication, efficient communication will differ from when I'm meeting a totally new person, communicating with this person for the very first time, who has grown up in a different country and is having totally different experiences from me. Then the way communicative efficiency is achieved might be different. And this indeed, also upon reflecting on these issues, this also invites for a reconsideration on then what communicative efficiency Sorry.
The defense is hereby concluded. I return the floor to the PhD candidate for the final time.
Having defended my dissertation to the best of my ability, I would like to thank the rector and my supervisor and co-supervisor, as well as all those who have honored the ceremony with their presence.
The doctoral examination board will retreat for its deliberation. On behalf of the Doctorate Board of Radboud University Nijmegen, we have decided to award you the degree of doctor. I invite the promoter, Professor Özürek, to discharge the task assigned to her.
Okay, thank you. In the name of the Lord, with the power entrusted by law to the Doctorate Board, I hereby confer upon you, Anita Slonimska, born in Riga, the title of doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, with the distinction Cum Laude. Yeah, for special achievements to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to academia and society. As proof thereof, I present you with this doctoral diploma signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisor and course supervisor.
And we will now have the laudatio, which will be given by Professor Özürek and by the co-promoter, Dr. Olga Capirci, and we will be seated while listening to it.
Okay, dear Anita, Dr. Slonimska, finally here we are. You can take a deep breath. You did very, very well. Me and your other promoter, Olga Capirci, are very proud of you, and we will congratulate you with 2 short laudacios. Hopefully they'll be short. Anita, to me, you're a person with many countries, cultures, languages, and probably personalities. You have a life in Latvia, your family here. You have a life in Netherlands, and you also feel Italian at heart. You speak Latvian, you speak English, you speak Italian, and you're proficient in Italian Sign Language, and I hear you're also learning Turkish. In addition to your scientific life, you're also a professional photographer and a filmmaker. So, and who knows how many other sides you have and how many other personalities that I haven't yet discovered. And of course, you're also very multi-talented. That comes with your multiculturality. I first met you when me and Dr. Emanuela Campisi, who came all the way here from Catania for this event, and who was doing a postdoctoral here at the MPI with me many years ago. And we were looking for an Italian speaker to help coding dataset on how Italians use gestures, Sicilians. Upon reading your CV and realizing surprisingly that you are a very good Italian speaker, we immediately hired you, and the rest was history. I can still see how this initial project, as well as your work with other advisors, Sean Roberts, at the time influenced you for the ideas you pursued in your thesis and specifically on the language evolution aspect. During your thesis, you managed to survive managing life in 3 different countries and COVID lockdowns. But you're a survivor and a perfectionist. So nothing really could stop you. I enjoyed all our discussions on Zoom or in person and in different countries and learned a lot from you on how to think about communicative efficiency, which is highly debated in the domain of sign language. And I'm sure in the many years to come, we will discuss on this notion. This was an eye-opener for me how to learn how you think. So I think the best theses are the ones when your advisor learns from your student. And this was definitely a case. So I feel very lucky to continue to work with you, thanks to the generous MPI funding, in the coming years and continue our collaborations, nice interactions, and Latvian cookies and drinks. They are very yummy. I'm also grateful to you supporting me in startup stages of the new multimodal language department and during the selection stage leading to it. Finally, I would also like to thank your family for sharing you with us and supporting you from a distance. Ups, Veichu.
Oh.
So, it was on May 11, 2060, when I, with the other member of the commission, had our first online interview with Anita as potential participant to the DT Communication in Sign Language project. Anita had an excellent CV and had already had experience on gesture research, working with Professor Asli Ozurek and also Manuela Campisi, and she also had completed a course, introductory course of sign language in Netherlands, but she was not yet a fluent signer, and even less did she have any knowledge of Italian Sign Language. Yet, during the interview, Anita was able to convince all of us of her dedication to these topics and show such enthusiasm that I decided to accept this challenge. Today I can say that it was the right choice, as Anita's work exceeded all my expectations. Anita has soon enrolled in a 3-year lease course that she always attended with great commitment and also, I must state, showing very good disposition towards sign language acquisition. In fact, she was soon able to communicate effectively with the 4 deaf colleagues present in our lab in Rome, and more importantly, she soon adapted to an Italian outgoing, expansive, exuberant, and in some ways intrusive work environment. In short, very soon she managed to be at home while far from home. This meant that sharing her work, helping others, but also sharing laughter and tears, coffee and lunches all together around our library meeting table. Anita and I shared the same room during 3 years in Rome, and this led to us having continuous exchange after getting entangled in philosophical discussion on the true nature of human language. Meanwhile, Anita was reading and studying a lot, and her desk gradually became full of piles of articles, even hiding her from view. I will always remember the many trips we made together, our beautiful dinner in Paris, the best one, the cornetti with pistachio cream that she brought to the office on the days when we needed an extra charge. Our challenging discussion on multiple topics, trying to keep an open mind and free ourselves on any pattern until we got lost in our reflections, and the great passion and commitment that Anita was always ready to put in her work. So this is what I feel like saying to you, Anita, today. You did it. And this demonstrates your strength not only as a researcher, but more importantly, as a young woman of talent. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you very much, Professor Özrek and Dr. Olga Kapirci, and congratulations to you, Dr. Anita Slonimska. On behalf of the doctorate board, I would like to congratulate you. I would also like to include your mother, your partner, and your sister in these congratulations. After this session, we will go downstairs and where there's an opportunity to congratulate the new doctor, the Cum Laude doctor, with her achievement. And now I would like to ask you to stand up to close this meeting with a formal prayer. Gratias tibi agimus omnipotens Deus, pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum. Amen.